The year was 1925. Inside the U.S. Army War College, men in pressed khaki uniforms leaned over a stack of reports thicker than a Bible. The title across the cover read, "The Use of Negro Manpower in Wartime." Its conclusion was as poisonous as it was confident. Black Americans, it declared, were mentally inferior, morally unstable, and psychologically unfit for combat leadership. That single document became gospel across the War Department. For the next decade, its words sealed hangar doors before they ever opened. No black pilot would touch an Army Air Corps aircraft, not because they lacked skill, but because a handful of officers lacked imagination. Across America, a new generation of dreamers refused to listen. In Chicago, the Coffee School of Aeronautics trained black civilians to fly, despite having no government support. In Texas, young men worked double shifts just to afford an hour in a beat-up trainer. And in Harlem, newspapers thundered a single question that echoed through every segregated street corner. How can America fight for democracy abroad while denying it at home? Still, Washington stood firm until political pressure turned into public embarrassment. Civil rights leaders like Walter White and A. Philip Randolph began lobbying President Roosevelt directly. Randolph threatened a nationwide march on Washington, tens of thousands of black workers flooding the Capitol, demanding equal access to defense jobs and military service. Roosevelt blinked. In 1939, he signed Public Law 18, a tiny clause tucked into an appropriations bill. It authorized training of Negro pilots, a phrase so hesitant it read like a reluctant sigh. Behind closed doors, generals called it an experiment. Privately, they expected it to fail. If those pilots washed out, the Army could say, "See, we tried. Case closed." But history has a habit of humiliating those who underestimate human will. At the center of this so-called experiment stood one man, Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., son of America's first black general. Graduate of West Point, where his classmates had spoken not a single voluntary word to him for 4 years. No jokes, no greetings, not even a handshake. They thought silence would break him. Instead, it forged him. When Davis accepted command of the new unit, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, he understood the stakes. Failure would not just doom the program. It would reinforce every racist myth in that 1925 report. Success, if they could survive long enough to prove it, might rewrite the entire future of the U.S. military. As he addressed his recruits on the red clay airfield of Tuskegee, Alabama, the air shimmered with heat and history. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "they think we can't. Let's make them regret it." Engines coughed to life, propellers blurred. The myth of incompetence was about to meet reality at 10,000 feet. Tuskegee, Alabama. Spring, 1941. The air smelled of hot oil and red clay. A brand new airfield, built almost overnight, shimmered under the southern sun. To the locals, it was just another military project. To the men who arrived by train that week, it was sacred ground. They came from Chicago, Harlem, Detroit, and Birmingham. Sons of teachers, mechanics, preachers, and farmers. Each carried the same impossible dream to fly for a country that still forced them to the back of the bus. When they stepped off those trains, white instructors smirked. One sergeant muttered, "Let's see how long these boys last." But inside the mess hall, Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. stood calm, his uniform crisp, his eyes steady. "Gentlemen," he told them, "the eyes of a nation are on you. You will be perfect, or you will be nothing." And so began the most demanding flight program in the Army Air Corps. Cadets studied physics, navigation, engine mechanics, subjects many had never been allowed to learn in segregated schools. When their hands blistered from cranking propellers in the heat, Davis simply said, "Good. You're learning the feel of discipline." Instructors often sabotaged them with old, temperamental aircraft. Fuel leaks, misfiring engines, missing instruments, the kind of defects that would ground any white trainee. But the men refused to quit. They learned to fix what broke. They learned to fly with instinct, not mercy. When a plane sputtered mid-air, they coaxed it home like a wounded bird. And they learned to fight a war. None of their manuals mentioned the war of perception. Every mistake, every rough landing was proof to the skeptics that the experiment was failing. So failure became forbidden. Cadets flew by day, studied by night, and drilled until exhaustion blurred the line between fear and focus. Over time, something extraordinary took shape. The men who began as strangers became a brotherhood bound by precision. They learned to move as one, to fly in perfect formation, so tight that a white instructor once shouted, half in awe, "They're closer than we ever dared." By 1942, the first class graduated. They stood on the runway in spotless uniforms, the sun glinting off silver wings pinned to dark jackets. No fanfare, no bands, just quiet pride. The Army assigned them to the 99th Pursuit Squadron, 26 pilots. All black, all watched with suspicion. Their commander would be Davis himself. When the 99th deployed to North Africa in April 1943, their white commanding officer, Colonel William Momia, made his feelings clear. He didn't trust them. He restricted their missions to harmless patrols, kept them away from major engagements, and waited for them to slip. But war has a way of exposing truth faster than prejudice can hide it. On June 2, 1943, the 99th flew its first combat mission over Pantelleria, Italy. Enemy anti-aircraft fire rained up from below. The Tuskegee pilots held their formation like steel. Not one bomber was lost. Momia grumbled it was luck. Davis called it proof. A month later, luck met destiny. July 2, 1943. The Castel Vatrino airfield in Sicily thundered with the sound of engines. Above the Mediterranean, the morning sky shimmered like liquid steel. Somewhere among the scattered clouds, Lieutenant Charles B. Hall, 22 years old, gripped the controls of his Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. Hall had been flying combat patrols for weeks, watching, waiting, enduring the unspoken question whispered through the ranks, "Can a Negro really fight?" That morning, the answer came in tracer fire. A German Focke-Wulf 190 screamed across his line of sight, fast, lethal, arrogant. Its pilot, seasoned by countless victories, didn't even see Hall coming. The P-40 dove from above, guns blazing. A storm of 50 caliber rounds tore through aluminum skin. Flames burst from the German fuselage. The fighter spiraled downward in a trail of black smoke before slamming into the ground. For a heartbeat, the radio stayed silent. Then Hall's voice crackled through. "I got him." It was more than a victory. It was history, the first confirmed aerial kill by a black American pilot in World War II. When Hall landed, the ground crew gathered around his Warhawk. He climbed down, sweat streaking through dust, the smell of burned fuel still clinging to his flight suit. Someone handed him a paintbrush and a small can of white paint. With a steady hand, Hall drew a swastika on the side of his P-40, the first of many that would soon decorate red-tailed fighters across Europe. But not everyone celebrated. Back in Washington, the Army's Public Relations Office hesitated to release his photo. Some feared that white America wasn't ready to see a black man hailed as a hero. Instead, his story appeared quietly, buried in small columns of black newspapers under headlines, like Negro pilot downs Nazi plane. To his people, it was a moment of triumph. To the War Department, it was an inconvenient miracle. Across the Atlantic, German propaganda officers mocked the idea that black pilots could threaten the Luftwaffe. They called them Schwarzvogelmenschen, black bird men. The tone was contemptuous until reports began piling in. By the end of that summer, the 99th Squadron had flown dozens of successful missions. Their discipline, their precision, and their refusal to break formation under fire started turning heads. The same white officers who had dismissed them began quietly requesting their escort. But in war, respect is never handed, it's earned in smoke and blood. In January 1944, the Tuskegee men proved they were no fluke. At Anzio, they took to the skies against superior German aircraft Messerschmitt 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf 190 seconds, flying outdated P-40 seconds that were slower and less agile. For 2 days, they fought wave after wave. When the smoke cleared, 13 German planes were down. Not one bomber they escorted was lost. Colonel Momier could no longer deny the truth. The men he'd dismissed as experimental were outperforming seasoned white squadrons. The Tuskegee experiment had become a revolution, and the world was about to learn their name. By mid-1944, the skies over Italy and southern France belonged to a new kind of fighter group. They weren't the fastest, they weren't the most decorated, but they were the most disciplined, and they had something no statistic could measure: unity, born from rejection. The 99th had proven itself, and now it was joined by 3 more all-black squadrons, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd. Together, they formed the 332nd Fighter Group under the same quiet, relentless commander, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. The Army finally gave them what they had long demanded: better planes. The P-51 Mustang, sleek, fast, long-ranger, masterpiece of engineering. The men studied every bolt, every gauge, every quirk of its engine until they could sense its limits, like an extension of their own nerves. Then came the choice that would make them immortal. During repainting at the base in Ramitelli, Italy, the pilots decided to give their Mustangs a signature look. Crimson red tails bright enough to be seen from miles away. It wasn't just a paint job, it was a declaration. We're here, we belong, and you'll never forget us. Bomber crews began to notice. At first, the color drew laughter, painted tails for painted boys. Some sneered. But then, something changed. Every time those red tails appeared in the sky, bombers came home. Unlike many other fighter groups, the 332nd refused to abandon their charges to chase personal glory. They stayed close, always. They flew a tight formation over the bomber groups, protecting every B-17 and B-24 until the last one touched friendly soil. Their discipline frustrated rival pilots who bragged about high kill counts. But to the men inside those lumbering bombers, it meant survival. A radio operator from the 15th Air Force later said, "When we saw the red tails above us, we breathed easier. We knew we'd make it home." Word spread across the front lines. Soon, bomber crews were making special requests. "Give us the red tails." Their first major tests came over central Italy and the Balkans. They escorted bombers deep into enemy territory: Vienna, Budapest, Munich. Flak bursts tore holes through the sky. German fighters dove from the sun. But mission after mission, the red tails held. They didn't break ranks, didn't chase kills, didn't lose focus. Their results spoke louder than propaganda. By late 1944, the red tails had flown over 1,000 escort missions. Only 27 bombers had been lost under their watch, a record far below the average. Still, the prejudice lingered. Some officers insisted the statistics were exaggerated. Others claimed the Germans avoided them out of pity. But when the red tails intercepted and shredded an entire formation of Focke-Wulfs in a single day, even cynics fell silent. The red tails had earned a reputation that traveled faster than any rumor. To bomber crews, they were guardian angels. To the Luftwaffe, they were ghosts painted in crimson. And soon, they would face a challenge. Unlike anything the skies had ever seen, a battle not against propellers and pistons, but against the future itself. March 1945. The war in Europe was nearing its bloody end, but the skies over Germany were deadlier than ever. Hitler had unleashed his last desperate weapon, the Messerschmitt 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was a monster of speed, 540 miles an hour, faster than anything the Allies could field. Propeller-driven Mustangs had no business trying to fight it. But when the Red Tails were called to escort bombers on a deep strike into Berlin, they knew the jets would come. The morning of the mission, the Ramitelli airstrip buzzed with quiet tension. Pilots checked oxygen lines, loaded ammunition, and stared into the pale dawn. Colonel Davis gathered them near the line of crimson-tailed P-51 seconds. "Remember what we do best," he said. "We protect. We don't break." Engines roared to life. The ground trembled. 51 Mustangs lifted into the cold air, heading straight into the heart of Germany. High above the clouds, contrails stretched across the horizon. Then, like silver knives, the German jets appeared streaking through the bomber formations at impossible speed. Their cannon fire ripped through the sky, shredding aluminum wings and engines. To the bombers below, they looked like demons, untouchable, unstoppable. But Davis had studied their weakness. The Me-262 could outrun any Mustang, but not in a turn. Its jet engines needed time to throttle, and its pilots struggled in tight maneuvers. He barked into his radio, "Catch them when they turn. Make them bleed speed." The Red Tails dove as one. Gunfire flared. One jet, caught mid-turn, exploded in a burst of fire. Another tried to climb, but a Mustang cut across its path. Guns blazing debris spiraled through the thin air. A third, Me-262, rolled out too wide and caught a perfect burst from 50 caliber guns. In seconds, the sky that had belonged to the Germans belonged to the Red Tails again. 3 jet kills in a single mission, more than many entire Allied units achieved during the war. Berlin's defenders had been humiliated. The Luftwaffe command radioed orders to retreat. The bombers, miraculously, made it home with minimal losses. One pilot, decades later, said quietly, "Those Red Tails didn't just save us, they saved our faith in the sky." When the Red Tails landed, their P-51 seconds were pocked with bullet holes. A few limped home on fumes, but none were lost. Mechanics cheered as pilots climbed out, exhausted but grinning. Someone painted 3 jet silhouettes under the nose of a Mustang, a mark of history. That day, over the ruins of Berlin, they had done the impossible again, outflown the future, outfought the myth, and outrun the lie that they were ever less than equal. But victory in the sky didn't mean victory on the ground, because when the war ended, the second, crueler battle began. When the gunfire finally stopped over Europe in May 1945, the Red Tails came home expecting handshakes and open doors. What they found instead were the same locked hearts they had left behind. At the docks and train stations, white officers received parades, interviews, and brass bands. The Tuskegee airmen were told to use the colored exit. Some couldn't even get a cup of coffee at the same diner they dreamed of flying over. One pilot later said, "I could escort a bomber through German flak and Messerschmitts, but I couldn't buy a hamburger in Alabama." The irony was staggering. In Europe, captured Red Tails held in German prison camps had sometimes been treated with more basic respect than in their own homeland. POW guards, bound by the Geneva Convention, addressed them as soldiers, something many Americans still refuse to do. Yet, despite the humiliation, the men refused to bow. They gathered in small veterans' halls and church basements, still wearing their flight jackets, still calling each other by call signs earned in fire. They spoke about the double V victory abroad and victory at home. Their record had given them a new kind of weapon, undeniable proof. 15,000 sorties, over 1,000 missions, 112 aerial victories, 96 distinguished flying crosses. Only 27 bombers lost under their escort, a number every statistician in Washington double-checked, then quietly confirmed. Every number was a bullet through the myth of inferiority. But not everyone wanted to hear it. Some officers tried to bury their accomplishments in paperwork. Reports were lost, awards delayed, recommendations quietly shelved. And yet, word of mouth spread faster than bureaucracy could silence. Bomber crews told their stories to families, reporters, and senators. One crewman from the 483rd Bomb Group wrote home, "If the red tails are on your wing, you'll live to see your wife again." Pressure began to mount on the government. The contradictions could no longer be ignored. How could America claim to lead the free world while segregating its own heroes? And then, history turned its head once more toward the man who had once endured silence at West Point, the same man who had taught his pilots to fight without hate, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. In the years after the war, Davis wrote detailed reports to the Pentagon, blunt, factual, and fearless. He argued that segregation weakened the military, that integration wasn't charity but strategy. At first, his words landed on deaf ears. But as the Cold War began, the United States could no longer afford hypocrisy in its ranks. The world was watching, and the world remembered the red tails. 3 years later, in 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, mandating the desegregation of the U.S. Armed Forces. Its inspiration was no secret. In the President's notes, one phrase appeared again and again: performance of Negro airmen in combat. The Red Tails had won the war within the war, not through protest or slogans, but through precision, discipline, and unshakable dignity at 25,000 feet. The years after 1948 were quiet at first. The newspapers moved on. The nation began to rebuild. But the men of Tuskegee carried something no medal could measure: proof that courage has no color. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. rose through the ranks, eventually pinning the star of America's first black general onto his shoulder. When he entered a briefing room, even the men who had once ignored him now stood at attention. He didn't gloat. He simply saluted the same quiet salute he'd given his cadets back in Alabama. The Red Tails themselves scattered across the post-war world. Some stayed in the Air Force. Others became commercial pilots, engineers, teachers, and mentors for a generation that would later march in Selma and sit in at lunch counters. When a young Martin Luther King, Jr. spoke of dignity and discipline, he echoed lessons the Tuskegee men had lived in the clouds. By the late 1960s, their story was nearly forgotten, buried under new wars and new struggles. But history has a way of circling back. Decades later, when the United States Air Force opened its archives, the numbers told a story that could no longer be ignored. The 332nd Fighter Group had logged more than 15,000 combat sorties, earned 3 presidential unit citations, and rewritten the record books for escort precision. In 2007, the U.S. Congress gathered to correct the silence. Surviving Tuskegee airmen, now in their 80s and 90s, stood in dress uniforms as President George W. Bush placed the Congressional Gold Medal in their hands. He looked at them and said, "You helped win a war, and you helped change our nation forever." Behind those aging eyes were memories of burning skies, the sound of Merlin engines, the flash of tracer rounds, and the quiet pride of coming home to a country that had finally begun to see them. Today, every U.S. Air Force cadet learns their story. Every pilot who paints an aircraft tail red knows it's not decoration, it's inheritance. Their discipline became doctrine. Their defiance became legend. The Germans who once mocked them admitted, years later, they were among the best we ever faced. And the bomber crews who survived still call them by the same name, whispered through headsets over Italy. The Red Tail Angels. July 2nd, 1943. A young man named Charles B. Hall downed a German fighter over Sicily and unknowingly changed the course of two nations. From that single burst of gunfire grew a legacy that tore down walls thicker than concrete walls built from ignorance, fear, and hate. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that excellence needs no permission. They fought fascism abroad and prejudice at home, and somehow they won both. They didn't just protect bombers, they protected ideals. They didn't just fly through flak, they flew through history's doubt. In the end, they gave America something it didn't yet deserve, proof that justice can rise on crimson wings. The engines fade, the sky quiets, and somewhere in that silence, you can almost hear them, the steady hum of a P-51 Mustang, cutting through clouds, carrying the memory of men who turned mockery into glory, and left their signatures written forever in smoke and sky.